Well, good morning. It's great to welcome you to this 18th day of Common Learning. The Day of Common Learning is set apart for us to gather as a community, to critically engage in topics that are pertinent to us as learners, scholars, and followers of Christ, creating space for contemplation, fruitful discussions and conversations, and refining our response to some of life's most complicated and complex challenges and opportunities. This year, we're delighted to have our speaker, his thoughts, his words, his ideas before us today, Dr. James K.A. Smith. His talk this morning will illuminate the focal point of today's conversation, practicing the prophetic. Today's lecture is particularly relevant to our university's mission as we seek to graduate people who can live a life of service with the capacity to recognize the gaps, the inequities, the needs of our world, and then imagine how life could or should be and work toward that end, answering questions such as, how are we to live in a world where the kingdom of God is both present and arriving? In what ways are the Christian intellect and imagination at odds, and how can that be remedied? What does kingdom-minded public engagement look like for Christians? And what difference do habitual postures such as worship and liturgy have to do with our spiritual formation? Well, today you'll have the opportunity to consider these questions at great length. And I invite you then to extend the conversations as we move into our sessions for this afternoon, 16 sessions that are listed in your program. I pray today is spiritually enriching and intellectually engaging for you. And now here to introduce our speaker is our provost, Dr. Bruce Congdon.
Good morning, and let me add my welcome to President Martins. I'm honored as your provost to introduce our speaker for the 2019 Day of Common Learning. James K.A. Smith is professor of philosophy at Calvin University, where he has, since 2013, held the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. A word about this honorary chair. From the Calvin website, Michigan State Senator Gary Biker and his wife Henrietta believed that their lives were part of the seamless web of God's creation, that every bit of this world is subject to the lordship of Christ. They saw the interrelated political, social, and economic dimensions of this world through the lens of biblical revelation and from a Reformed perspective. The Bikers appreciated the insights from many sources provided by the Bible, Greek and Roman classics, the writings of Calvin and Kuyper, and St. Augustine, among many others. The interdisciplinary vision for this chair is also evident in the diversity of its previous occupants that include a geographer and a sociologist. So this theme of interrelatedness, this interdisciplinarity, which is so central to the education both at Calvin and at SPU to which they are committed, is also central to Dr. Smith's work. He is an engaging and engaged public intellectual, cultural critic, widely traveled speaker, and a thought leader with a unique gift of translation, building bridges not only between disciplines, but between the academy, society, and the church. He is the author of a number of influential books, including Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, a book that has a special place in my heart, as I read it a decade ago, trying to understand what my daughter was learning in our English department. Also, he has written Desiring the Kingdom, How Not to Be Secular, You Are What You Love, and Awaiting the King. His latest book, On the Road with St. Augustine, was released this month and is available at the book table in the foyer. Dr. Smith also regularly writes for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Slate, First Things, Christianity Today, Books and Culture, and the Hedgehog Review. He serves as editor-in-chief of the Image Journal, a quarterly devoted to art, mystery, and faith that is housed on the SPU campus. This morning, Dr. Smith will be focusing on themes from his book, Awaiting the King, Reforming Public Theology. His talk is titled Practicing the Prophetic, Liturgy, Formation, and Discernment for Public Life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm introduction and reception. It's a treat. Because I'm editor-in-chief of Image now, I actually get a fairly regular opportunity to come visit the SPU campus, which I have quite fallen in love with and have really enjoyed getting to know some of your faculty and the community. I love this whole idea of a day of common learning. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for a university to gather around ideas at the intersection of faith and society. So it's really an honor and a privilege to try to contribute to your conversations today. A funny thing happened as Christians marched out to transform culture. They were transformed by it. We overestimated our convictions and powers of resistance and underestimated how cultural forces can deform us. Not because they change how we think, but because they actually transform what we love. Indeed, I'm reminded of a very jarring scene at the conclusion of Orwell's 1984. Winston Smith, you will recall, takes himself to be a resistor. He can endure the charades of the 2-minute hate and other civic rituals because he possesses something that he thinks is internal and secret. He assured Julia over and over again, they can't get inside you. When he is finally captured, he learns that what the party requires isn't just obedience. What the party requires isn't just allegiance. What the party actually requires is love. It's not enough to obey Big Brother, O'Brien tells him. You must love him. And in fact, they did find a way inside him. At the very end, you might recall, it says, he gazed up at the enormous face of Big Brother. 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breast. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle had finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Friends, what has come to infect Christian public engagement isn't bad policy or even just misguided thinking. It is what St. Augustine would diagnose as a disorder of our loves. And that's what I want to think about with you tonight this morning, under the rubric of the prophetic. The first aspect of the prophetic is accounting for the assimilation of Christians to the defaults of the majority culture, the tribalism, the consumerism, the partisan polarization. And I think there are 2 aspects to help us account for this assimilation. The first thing is we missed the liturgical nature of politics and public life. We missed the liturgical nature. What I mean by that is we missed the fact that the rhythms and rituals of public life aren't just something that we do, they are also doing something to us. So the public into which we confidently bestride with marching orders for transformation is not a neutral space. It is rife with its own rituals and liturgies that often bypass our convictions and conscript our affections. So we fall prey to cultural idolatries, not because we've been convinced by bad ideas, as much as we've been converted by these disordered liturgies, we might call them. So we miss the liturgical nature of our public immersion, our political immersion, perhaps especially. But second, on the flip side, I also think we've underestimated, we haven't appreciated what we might call the political nature of the church. Not by that, I don't mean the partisan nature of the church. What I mean is that Christian worship is in many ways the civics of the city of God. The spiritual disciplines are modes of formation for public life. The formative pedagogies of the classroom, animated by the biblical narrative, are their own sorts of apprenticeships to answer the call to love our neighbors. So the practices and disciplines of historic Christianity carry what we might call a gospeled social imaginary, rehearsing a biblical vision for what the prophets call over and over again, shalom, flourishing, justice. And that vision of shalom is caught by our immersion in the body of Christ and then is offered as a gift for our neighbors. This is where I think the Christian liberal arts project of an institution like Seattle Pacific is really a fulcrum for cultivating a prophetic witness in our cultural moment. The formation of citizens and civil servants, social workers and entrepreneurs who can contribute to the renewal and redemption of our public life does depend in many ways on the renewal of both the church and the Christian university as biblically saturated, Christ-haunted imagination stations from which we are sent to love our neighbors, to steward creation, and to build institutions that guard the vulnerable. What we need then is not just right thinking and the best curriculum. What we need is to have our loves reformed and reordered by the civics of the city of God, precisely so we might know how to then prudentially forge a common life in the society in which we find ourselves in this meantime of our waiting. When we can become a people who learn to love what Christ the King loves, but also learn how to await his coming, we will be better equipped for the messy work of faithful compromise that characterizes public life. Now, to be perfectly honest, I can imagine some of my so-called secular neighbors getting a bit anxious at this point, that they get worried that theonomy is kind of around the corner if people start talking about Christ the King. But I actually want to suggest to my fellow citizens who don't share my faith that in fact the opposite is the case. That paradoxically, in a way, even my fellow citizens who don't share my faith should hope for a more Christian politics from Christians in public life. Because what passes for Christian politics today is usually a sub-Christian syncretism that prays to a vaguely moralistic God who plays favorites, a deity of our making trotted out to license nationalism and self-interest. What calls itself a Christian politics actually shows very little signs of being disturbed by the cross, or the ascension, or the eschaton. If anything, it is governed by what St. Augustine called the libido dominandi, the lust for domination, and is concerned only with winning, revenge, and resentment. In other words, too much of our so-called Christian politics seems to have been captivated by precisely the liturgies that I've described, the liturgies of what Augustine would call the earthly city rather than the city of God. This is why I want to suggest that actually one of the best hopes for our world and for our society and for my neighbors is that we would have a more robust and specifically Christian public witness that would be a gift to a pluralist society even if it is also a prophetic challenge. So I want to suggest that oh yeah, sorry, I hardly ever use slides, can you tell? I want to suggest that we in the 21st century have a lot to learn from an ancient African. St. Augustine, who, for those of you who aren't familiar, lived in the late 300s and early 400s in North Africa of what would be today contemporary Algeria. I think St. Augustine offers us a kind of toolkit for thinking through our public vocations, a framework that is at once perennial and timely, it seems to me. I want to give you just a taste as an example. Consider Augustine's ongoing correspondence with a figure named Boniface, who was a Roman general and African governor who served in political office during a time of tumult and upheaval, which should sound familiar. When later in his life, Boniface wants to actually chuck all of this public engagement and responsibility and service, when he wants to chuck it all and retreat to the desert and withdraw to what he called holy leisure, Augustine won't let him off the hook. He writes him pointedly and directly and says, you have a calling. Augustine challenges him. Man your station, he exhorts. God and his church need you to play the public and political role you've been called to. Not even the difficulty and corruption of the political environment is sufficient to excuse Boniface from his call. There is a way in which he says you owe something to the earthly city, even if your ultimate hope is a city to come. But then there's this long ongoing correspondence between Augustine and Boniface. And later we see, actually, okay, so Boniface sticks with his public calling, and then he decides, I'm just going to make things happen. I'm going to impose my will. I'm going to make the kingdom arrive. And at that point, Augustine writes him with another very prescient word. When Boniface is frustrated and tempted to impose his will, as if it were up to him to make the kingdom come, Augustine cautions him and says this: we ought not to want to live ahead of time with only the saints and the righteous. We ought not want to live ahead of time. I think that's a really pretty good motto for a caution for any Christian involvement in public and political life. We don't make the kingdom come. We are trying to get caught up in what the Spirit is doing. We ought not to live ahead of time with only the saints and righteous. So what I want to suggest to you this morning is at the heart of the prophetic, as I'm trying to articulate it, is actually the virtue, the calling of discernment. So discernment is actually the phrase I want you to walk away with this morning. And there are two sides to this discernment, okay? The first side is taking stock of ourselves. Prophetic, the prophets were always sent to the people of God. It was the fire starts at home, so to speak. And so what we have to do, the first movement of the prophetic, is to take stock of ourselves. And I want to frame this as taking a liturgical audit of our lives. We need to learn to take a liturgical audit of our lives. And I would also add, we need to learn to take a liturgical audit of our institutions. Let me explain what I mean. Here's the sorts of questions that prophetically we need to ask ourselves. What are the things that I do that are doing something to me? What are the liturgies in my life, the rhythms, the routines, the repertoires that aren't just something that I do, but are in fact doing something to me because they are actually shaping my loves, my affections, and hence my vision for what the world ought to be? What are the things I do? What are the rhythms and repertoires that I give myself over to that are actually transforming what I want and therefore what I think I want for the world? In some ways, the prophetic question we have to ask ourselves is, how could it be that I might love something other than what I think? That's when we start to realize how cultural liturgies can deform and disorder us. This is how we begin to diagnose our assimilation. I think this is how we need to think through, for example, our capitulation to consumerism. Nobody becomes a consumerist because some apologist for the market walks up to you and gives you an argument and says, here are 14 reasons why stuff will make you happy. Right? You're not convinced by consumerism as an idea. You are conscripted by consumerism's rituals and liturgies that bypass your thinking and attract and affect your heart's desires and longings. That's how our disordered loves happen. It's how we capitulate to consumerism. It's how we capitulate to nationalism. It's how we capitulate to political tribalism. And it's also just the way the kind of bland narcissism that is the default of our culture works on us. We get conscripted by liturgies and rituals that transform us. But I want to focus on one particular example this morning of taking a liturgical audit of our lives and institutions, because I think it's a potent one and will help illustrate what I'm talking about. I think this liturgical mode of analysis is the only possible way that we will ever be able to adequately address how and why racism and white supremacy are still bedeviling our society. Because this is how racism and white supremacy have covertly captivated so many Christians and institutions. Let me try to explain. What we need to realize is that racism isn't simply a set of beliefs. It's not just an intellectual grid of propositions that some people believe, but we can obviously reject as false. If you imagine that racism and white supremacy is just an ideology, then what you can do is you can sort of confidently assure yourself that you don't believe X, Y, and Z. But if you take a liturgical analysis and audit, you start to realize that what you believe can be very different than what you have been conscripted to want, to love, to hope for. Racism, in this sense, if you take a liturgical analysis, racism is baked in at the level of a social imaginary, and it is absorbed in the same way through images, stories, myths, rituals, through practices, through cultural liturgies in which this racialized imaginary is caught more than it's taught. This, of course, is the disturbing insight of Brian Bantam's provocative book, Redeeming Mulatto, which is to highlight how racist formation is its own kind of perverted discipleship. It's a social imaginary we absorb not only from secular liturgies, but in fact from misdirected, co-opted Christian worship as well. Listen to this one description from Bantam. Racial identity, he says, constitutes a form of discipleship that must be theologically accounted for and resisted. That racial performance exists as a social phenomenon is certainly a challenge to Christian discipleship. Racial performance is not simply a sinful behavior that must be avoided, but a way of being in the world that is more than difficult to resist, for it is the air we breathe. It's what we swim in. It's inhaled more than it's believed. This is why the way forward begins in a forthright stock-taking of our deformation, which is itself a prelude to repentance. To imagine a life in Christ, Bantam counsels, we must begin to reimagine the shape of our unfaithfulness, our complicity in the economy of race, in order to faithfully imagine what it might mean to participate in the renunciation of an old life marked by the tragedy and violence of race. This is why a reformed way of life, not just a changed thinking, but a reformed way of life requires countermeasures of alternative practices, alternative liturgies. And that, friends, is how I want to frame what's at stake in historic Christianity. That Christian liturgy and the pedagogies that draw upon their formative power are meant to be countermeasures that are not only changing my thinking about such matters, but are actually transforming my wants, my longings, my hopes, what I'm desiring for the world. We can only practice our way out of them and into the radical true story of the God who in Christ is reconciling all things to himself. You can't think your way out of disordered loves. It takes practice. And what Christ offers is a community of practice, not just an information dissemination station. Now, I want to suggest that, in fact, a university is the perfect place for serious reflection on our cultural immersions, a place and a time to become more intentional about the communities of practice that we give ourselves over. To practice the prophetic, we need to apprentice ourselves to the prophet whose proclamation led to a cross, who rose from the dead and calls us to solidarity with the captives he died to liberate. So the first move of the prophetic, practicing the prophetic, is a liturgical audit in which we take stock of our own deformations as individuals and as institutions. But now, secondly, positively, answering the call to public life and to live amongst our neighbors and with our neighbors. The second move of the prophetic is discerning openings and opportunities for collaboration. If we first need to discern our own formation and deformation and become intentional about our and transformation, we then also need to discern the Spirit's presence afoot in the world so that we can join in what God is doing to renew the earth. This is where I think it's really crucial to remember that the overarching arc of the biblical story is that we are formed to be sent. The outworking of mission, of missio, of sending, is always outward directed. It is centrifugal, not centripetal. If Christianity ultimately transcends national borders, our human finitude locates us in the specificity of the nations, states, municipalities, and neighborhoods in which we find ourselves. So we are called and sent, we're formed to be sent into those spaces. This is why, in the biblical picture, our public and political calling is always crystallized in the language of the neighbor. Politics is the art of the possible, but it is an art undertaken for the sake of the common good. It's precisely because we are called to love our neighbors that this translates into a Christian obligation to invest in political institutions. And this is something I want to spend some time on. I think we live at a very, very crucial moment in which it would be easy to be cynical and withdraw from institutions. But I also want us to appreciate that that is, in fact, a recipe for abandoning our neighbors. What does this look like? It looks like a people formed in a story of renewal, redemption, and shalom, who then answer a call to be sent, and a lot of what their sending looks like is building, sustaining, and reforming institutions as the best way to care for vulnerable neighbors. And I think this is particularly pressing when those institutions seem to be eroding and our shared investment in those institutions are eroding. The sort of Christian public imagination I'm sketching here, for example, is not an enemy of liberal democracy. And it is not given to the demonization of liberalism that characterizes some reactionary, despairing stances that seem to be trending. To the contrary, the Christian public imagination I'm describing is attuned to the vagaries and contingencies of history and has an audacious claim to make that many of the institutions and that we value in liberalism and in constitutional democracy are, in fact, the fruit of the gospel. I have to allude to a difficult. Oh, that was another slide I forgot. It's very cool. Might come back to it. Oliver O'Donovan is a brilliant and almost unreadable British theologian and ethicist. But he gives this powerful, what I'm trying to say is, set up the point again. What I'm saying is, one of the reasons why Christians can't ever feel like they have permission to check out of the institutions in which we find ourselves is because in many ways, if we are discerning well, we will realize that those institutions are a legacy of the gospel's impact on the West. So there's no way that Christians can just demonize the institutions of liberal democracy because they are the fruit of Christianity. And Oliver O'Donovan gives this, he actually has there's one metaphor in his entire corpus, and it's this. Like the surface of a planet pocked with craters by the bombardment it receives from space, the governments of the passing age show the impact of Christ's dawning glory. Sorry, it's still a little dense. Let me read that one more time. Like the surface of a planet pocked with craters by the bombardment it receives from space, the governments of our passing age nonetheless show a similar impact, the crater marks of Christ's dawning glory. This is a city in Bavaria that is built in a crater, in a meteorite, asteroid crater. Christians should not anathematize liberalism precisely because it is one of the craters of the gospel's impact on political life in this age that we call the seculum. But neither should secular progressives imagine a dichotomy between Christian faith and the ideals of liberal democracy. In fact, those ideals live on the borrowed capital of the church's impact on our political lives. Liberalism and the sort of pluralist project that is the American experiment depends on formative communities that instill habits and dispositions in citizens that enable them to be patient, tolerant, humble, and forgiving. The American experiment actually depends on citizens who exhibit those virtues. But late modern liberalism hasn't created institutions that form such people. There might have been hope for our schools and universities doing that at some point, but I think that is misguided today. Instead, the American experiment has lived for too long on the borrowed capital of religious communities. In a way, I'm sorry if this is a prophetic point in another direction. Liberalism can't actually create the citizens it needs. So healthy, formative, unapologetically religious communities can actually be some of the most important incubators for the citizens our pluralist project needs. Imagine people who confess their sins, forgive as they are forgiven, trust in a grace beyond themselves are the sorts of people who should not be surprised by difference, have a deep patience in the face of frustration, and are just humble enough to listen to others. That all turns out to be pretty germane to the liberal democratic project. So a distinctly Christian political imagination has gifts to offer to a pluralist secular society. It's the exact opposite of theonomy. And more than ever, we need Christians answering the call to inhabit, tend, and enliven these institutions and practices. Too soon. Too soon. I was so encouraged to see that many of the seminars that are offered the rest of today intersect with the arts. That seems exactly right. What's at stake in our liturgical formation is really a restoring of the imagination. It's a restoring of the imagination because it's a restoring of the imagination. And if Christianity has something to offer our neighbors, I think that will be most powerfully and prophetically embodied in the arts, which meet people on the register of the imagination. So the art of prophetic hope is how I want to finish with you this morning. The art of prophetic hope requires both the renewal of the Christian imagination and an outward offering of a Christian imagination for the sake of the world. At the heart of Christian orthodoxy is a confession about time and history. That the creator of the cosmos erupted in time and history. The mystery of the enfleshed God in Bethlehem is a recalibration of the way we inhabit time. That doesn't mean that the Christian imagination is only nostalgic, a backward-looking debt to something that has happened. To the contrary, the Christian inhabits time as the fullness of what the New Testament calls kairos, and not just the tick-tock of chronos. There is a timeliness of God's presence to the world that is ever ancient and ever new. The long, bright shadow cast by the resurrection intersects with the light that reaches us from a kingdom that is to come. The Spirit is present to every age, but never reduced to the spirit of the age. That Spirit is a gift of the ascension of the Son, and the same Spirit groans for the renewal of all things, Paul tells us. So, the proclamation that the Word became flesh underwrites our daily prayer, "Thy kingdom come." Christian orthodoxy, as articulated in the Nicene Creed, is unabashedly calendrical. It's because the incarnate God was, quote, crucified for us under Pontius Pilate and rose again on the third day that we look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And that revelation of the world to come, the unveiling, the apocalypse, is a vision of a world brought to rights, of how things ought to be, of a shalom that is now elusive, but will then be everlasting. So what biblical scholar Richard Bauckham says about the book of Revelation, that apocalypse at the end of the Bible, might equally be true of art that is nourished by this Christian orientation in time. Now, I'm going to do something that your communication profs tell you never to do, which is have this big text-heavy slide. But I want you to hear this. This is from New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham. And he's talking about the book of Revelation, by the way, in a way that many of you maybe have not heard the book of Revelation discussed. The book of Revelation is not about end times. The book of Revelation is a revealing of the present in light of the kingdom to come. But I want you to hear what Bauckham says about the book of Revelation as also an analogy to what Christian art can do for the imagination. He says one of the functions of Revelation was to purge and refurbish the Christian imagination. It's why the book of Revelation is surreal, literally surreal, right? It tackles people's imaginative response to the world, which is at least as deep and influential as their intellectual convictions. It recognizes the way a dominant culture with its images and ideals constructs the world for us so that we perceive and respond to the world in its terms. Moreover, it unmasks this dominant construction of the world as an ideology of the powerful, which serves to maintain their power. In its place, Revelation offers a different way of perceiving the world, which leads people to resist and to challenge the effects of the dominant ideology. Moreover, since this different way of perceiving the world is fundamentally to open it to transcendence, it resists any absolutizing power or structure or ideals within this world. What is prophetic about this eschatology? What does Christianity offer to the contemporary imagination? Here's where I want to suggest that the prophetic aspect of the Christian social imagination is able to do something utterly unique. Nothing less than the ability to name evil and hope otherwise. The first moment is crucial. Christian hope refuses both Pollyannish optimism and despairing nihilism. The great critic Terry Eagleton has recently pointed out, he says, optimists are as bereft of hope as nihilists because they have no need of it. Christians are not optimists. Our inbuilt penchant to name evil, which persists with us and ought to, I actually want to suggest that culturally, the ability and penchant to name evil lives off of a kind of borrowed capital. That is, a merely naturalistic modernism doesn't actually offer the intellectual or imaginative resources to either decry evil or generate hope. Naturalism can only aver to the way things are, the pseudo-sovereignty of randomness and genetic predestination, which precludes the possibility of lament. All that is available to the naturalistic imagination is a description of the way things are. And if that's just the way things are, then one could never protest that something is askew, amiss, out of joint. But evil, of course, is the name we reserve for that which should not be. In that sense, evil is actually not a word properly available in the naturalist's lexicon. In contrast, Christianity has the intellectual and imaginative resources to say, that's not the way it's supposed to be. Thus, biblical faith can name evil as an eruption in the cosmos, one that God himself takes on and overcomes. Which is precisely why Christianity can also imagine a world without evil. Not by denying its existence, but because we hope in its overcoming based on the first fruits of the resurrection of Christ, which is already a sign that death will die. That is the difference between Christian hope and naive optimism. This, I would wager, speaks to deep-seated human hungers. The hope that the world could be otherwise, that injustices will be rectified, oppression will cease, pain will be nevermore. It's hard to imagine a gracious God speaking to a more human and humane desire than the promise at the end of the book of Revelation, that God himself will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. The king who sits on the throne in this kingdom still bears the scars on his hand and then announces, "Behold, I make all things new." There is nothing more scandalous than Christian eschatology, I realize, and yet nothing speaks more directly to a hurtful and fearful world. This eschatological orientation, which is at the heart of the prophets, fuels art that is suspended between the already and the not yet. The unique imaginative capacity of the arts speaks to this ineffaceable human hunger for restoration, even while honoring the heartbreak of our present pilgrimage. A Christian eschatology nourishes a distinct imagination that refuses to be constrained by the catalog of the currently available and instead imagines a world to come breaking into the present. Art that's infused with this eschatological imagination at once laments and hopes. In its lament, it honors our experience of brokenness, the heartbreak of the now, and in its hope, it gives voice to our longings. It neither wallows in romanticized tragedy nor escapes to sentimental naivete. Such eschatological art is like an embodied form of the Lord's Prayer. Each such work is its own requiem, such that what Jan Swafford says of Mozart's requiem could be true of all such eschatological art. He says it's full of death and hope, lacerating sorrow and uncanny beauty. I like this uncanniness metaphor. Uncanniness is an apt descriptor of such art that paints beauty with ashes, that can walk the soul through the valley of the shadow of death on the way to a feast in the wilderness. Such art stops us short in its uncanny, even paradoxical ability to embody both hurt and hope. So permit me to consider just a few examples from out of the way it works, of works that could be multiplied. So these aren't big famous things, but these are ones that have stopped me short in my journey at different points. Consider, for example, the tomb of Madame Longens, created in 1751 by German artist Johann August Noll for the grave of a pastor's wife lost in childbirth on Holy Saturday. That day, like the long age of the saeculum, suspended between death and resurrection. The grave, emblazoned with skulls, is a memento mori, a reminder of mortality. And the image of lost child and mother together is heartbreaking. But the seeds of hope are pictured for us in a different kind of rupture. Not the rupture of loss, but restoration as they rise, breaking through the grave, climbing up to new life. Can you see how that's a mother and child that are sort of breaking through the gravestone in preparation for the resurrection of the dead? We are almost teased by this possibility, and it kindles in us a cry of, Maranatha, come quickly, Lord Jesus, hasten the day when we can meet this child you've known since the womb. Or consider this public memorial to fallen workers in Hamilton, Ontario. Hamilton is Canada's Pittsburgh. It's Canada's steel town. We feel the danger that has consumed those who've built our bridges and the skyscrapers we ascend in the safety of ensconced elevators. Confronting us here is the tactile body of those workers who plunged to their deaths, consumed in the dams and the torrents they fought back, these martyrs of so-called progress. But can you see that shadow cast? Just who is hanging here? Does that shadow suggest another who hung on a tree, mocked with a crown of thorns we seem to see protruding from his head? Is that the same one who made a mockery of death by rising from the dead? Is that the shadow of hope cast over these lost workers too? Of course, it's not only death we hope will cease. It's all the death-dealing ways we treat one another. The systems of oppression and painful exclusion, which are their own perverted forms of human imaginating. Eschatological art laments. It rages against the injustices of might. It's no accident that the Bible's most evocative laments appear in the poetic books, in the Psalms and Lamentations. Lament is its own slant of light. Consider, for example, this work called Sugar and Spice, part of Letitia Huckabee's suffrage project. The print of a young African-American girl looks despondent. Her protest sign, enough, resting on her shoulder, is its own version of how long, oh Lord. The print appears on a vintage cotton picking sack. And once you realize that, an entire history of oppression and marginalization creeps up from your gut, up your spine, into your heart, halting at a lump in your throat. You don't need it to reach your mind. You now know something you didn't know before. And yet, that gentle pastel pink skirt evokes a ballerina's tutu. And the image births in us a longing to see this young girl dance, to see her despondency turn to joy, to trade the now necessary sign of protest for a banner of praise. Friends, may we be the generation that learned such choreography, learning paradoxically perhaps to dance our laments as a testament to hope. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Well, we have the opportunity to practice today, and there's a lot of opportunities to continue to learn along these themes. So I would encourage you, even if you're not required to go to the afternoon sessions, to really take a look at the program and see the offerings there. We have 16 sessions being offered this afternoon at 1 o'clock, and then the sessions are repeated at 2. So you have 2 chances to see those sessions. From nursing to finance to art, there's just a lot of opportunities to continue our learning today. And then at 3:30, Professor Smith will be available to answer questions for anyone who would like to learn more or to post questions that you had during his talk. And so that talkback session will be in Eaton Hall 112, for those of you who are interested. Thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate your presence today and your participation in this session. Have a good afternoon.